I'm going to give a lecture now.
Or you want to do tomorrow?
Tomorrow. Hello, good evening, and welcome. My name is Siddharthan Chandran, and on behalf of Edinburgh Neuroscience, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to what will be our 12th Christmas Public Neuroscience Lecture from Edinburgh. So one of the unexpected consequences of COVID is that we've been able to extend the reach of these sorts of lectures and forums from our normal events. So already I can see our participants are just shy of 300. We have 800 people registered. I'd anticipate at least half of those will attend this lecture, which would be at least 50, if not 100% more than we would normally get. And tonight we're very fortunate in that our lecturer is Thomas Bach. Many of you will know Thomas. I'm sure we're in for a real treat of a lecture. I've known Thomas for now nearly 2 decades. And he's unusual in that he brings together a rare combination of expertise and insight from his training and research in neurology, psychiatry, psychology, and linguistics. And he brings this knowledge to bear on the challenges and questions around the problems of how the brain functions, what goes wrong in disease, and how one might develop strategies to mitigate the impact of disease. And I think we'll see this very clearly today in Thomas's talk, where he's going to tell us about some ideas and concepts around the executive brain, what it means to a researcher, what it means to the public. And he will litter this conversation, I'm sure, with metaphors and great engagement. I should say that all of you are very welcome throughout the talk to pose questions via the Q&A panel. Then myself and the team will collate those, and we will have a chance to share some of those questions with Thomas. The plan is for the talk to be about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes, I hope, of Q&A, and we'll look to wrap up just this side of 7 o'clock. So on that note, I'd like to welcome Dr. Thomas Bach to tell us about the executive brain and why concepts matter. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody see the slides? Yeah?
I think, Thomas, we should assume that everyone can.
Okay, perfect. So, welcome to the Edinburgh Neuroscience Christmas Lecture 2020. Or, to be more precise theologically, welcome to Edinburgh Neuroscience Immaculate Conception Lecture. Because today, 8th of December, we have the feast of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. Now, for those of you who already started counting the days before now and Christmas, I need to clarify that this is the Immaculate Conception of Virgin Mary and not of Jesus Christ. The latter is the Annunciation in spring, 9 months as you would expect before Christmas. However, to start this lecture, I would take you to another feast, or the evening before the Feast of St. Martin, 10th of November 1619. We are in the company of a young French soldier enrolled in the Bavarian army and stationed in the small town of Neuburg an der Donau in southern Germany. Let us see what he says. I was then in Germany, where I had been drafted because of the wars, and the arrival of winter delayed me in quarters. Since I had no acquaintances to distract me, I used to spend the whole day alone in a room that was heated by a stove, where I had plenty of time to concentrate on my own thoughts. Now, some of you might already expect this young man is no one else as René Descartes, and the night is the night of the famous 3 dreams, where he started to think how he wants to build foundations for a new science and new philosophy. But I thought it's a kind of good start for us, because I realized that for some of us, this year has been the busiest ever if we work in frontline services. But for others, it could be a year of enforced inactivity if we couldn't do our usual experiments, participants, lab studies, and so on and so on. And what we have here is a young man of action. He just came from the coronation of the emperor in Frankfurt. Next year, the following year, he was believed to take part in one of the major battles of the 30th Year War in White Mountain near Prague. And yet here he is in enforced inactivity and makes the best out of it. So I think that should be one of the kind of topics or thoughts of this talk. Now, for me, the story starts in spring 2020 BC, so before COVID. And I was sitting in Milestone Hotel in London with my friend and colleague Dina Mehmetbegovic from UCL, with whom we developed the idea or the concept of health linguistic diet. And we were engaged in something which some of us might perceive as a modern scientific equivalent of warfare, namely looking through reviewers' comments to our chapter that we submitted to Routledge Handbook of Plurilingual Education. And one of the comments on the use of term executive functions was as follows. I wonder why you use the plural. I thought they were referred to in the singular. Please clarify. Now, at any other time, I would have probably just write a short remark. Well, sometimes maybe it is used in singular, but we always mean that they are different of functions and so on, they can dissociate. But as it happened, shortly thereafter the lockdown happened, and instead of going on my scholarships to India and China as I hoped, I was in my house all alone with many books and a lot of time to think. So I thought, why not thinking why this question was asked and what can it tell us about our understanding of executive functions? And the first thing I noticed is that I am definitely not the person to throw the first stone. So here are two of my favorite papers on bilingualism and cognition, and both of them have been published in volumes which have executive function in singular. However,
Thomas, can I just interrupt for a second and ask, could you speak up a little bit, because some people are having trouble hearing, and I know that we could hear you earlier. So
okay, yes.
Perfect. So, Thank you very much.
Yeah. However, I could console myself that I am not the only example of that. Namely, Paul Burgess, one of the main thinkers in this field, and I will mention him later on, has also a paper, Executive Function in Singular, although the first word of the paper is executive functions in plural, and it is in plural throughout. And also here you have another example of the singular and then used in plural. So I thought, why don't we have a look? What are the origins of the term executive, long before it came into neuropsychology? Now, the term executive, to execute or exécuter in French, was used in 17th century mainly in legal text, very often in connection with will. So execute a will was basically to fulfill the desires of the deceased person as formulated there. However, it was Montesquieu in 1748, in his fundamentally important L'Esprit des Lois, the spirit of laws, who made then a very clear distinction between making laws and executing them, already in the second book of this work. And in the 11th book, on the example of the English political system of his time, he distinguishes between legislative, which makes the laws, executive, which executes the laws, and judicative, which then supervises it. Now, this distinction has been very influential. It influenced a lot, for instance, American Constitution. The father of American Constitutions put it in action. But I would say this has also been one of the most important and controversial questions in our lockdown year. Namely, the question, who should have the authority to decide about the lockdowns? Is it the government, the executive, or the parliament, the legislative? A question that was answered in different ways in different countries and at different times. A similar view of executive is also used in the army, particularly in the Navy, where on the ship we have commanding officer, or the captain, and then executive officer, who is in fact second in command, and whose job it is to implement the decisions of the captain and make sure that they get executed. And in fact, current computer and science and artificial intelligence also use the term in a similar way. So here I'm citing from a book which hasn't appeared yet. It will appear on 28th of December, unfortunately a little bit too late for Christmas present, by Pickering and Garrett, where on the page 28 they distinguish between planning and implementation, and they mention that implementation is the execution, but they don't want to use the term executive because in psychology it is used for higher level processes. So we have quite a consistent use of the term, I would say, across very, very different disciplines and centuries. But how did we get from this humble serving executive to the glamorous executive of modern executive languages? Well, in business, also originally, it was executing the wishes of the owners. But with time, as the owners became shareholders, and many of them, there came a divergence between ownership and control. So the owners themselves couldn't make all the decisions, so the control was put in the hands of executive. And being an important position, it became increasingly associated with leadership and value formation. So that by the end of the 20th century, we have often executive associated with leadership and management associated with implementation. What would have been the executive in the Montesquieu term is becoming now the legislative, the leadership. Now, this is one of the earlier books I could find from 1916 by Gowin, The Executive and His Control of Man, not much space for gender equality here, a study in personal efficiency. And we can find all the attributes of leadership that we could find also nowadays: power, discipline, knowledge, originality, emotion, optimism and enthusiasm, transcending the limits of pure reason, and powerful agency of idealism. So we see here also that it's clear that for decision making, not only reasoning is important, but also emotions, something we'll come across when we speak about decision making in the brain later in this lecture. And we find adaptability to changing circumstances, which obviously in a year like this one would be of paramount importance. However, what is probably the most important, most influential book on executive was Chester Barnard, 1938, The Functions of the Executive. Barnard distinguishes between functions and positions, a distinction which again will become relevant when we speak about distinction between the localization and the function in the brain. So he distinguishes between persons who occupy executive positions and have executive titles and those who do really executive work, because he realizes that many institutions judge their employees more by the position they occupy than by the work they are doing. He also looks at the way how decisions are being made and mentions that they have to be based on intuitions that are correct, notwithstanding doctrines that deny its correctness. Again, an issue which will appear later on in the context of heuristics of decision making. However, what is possibly most important in this context is his conscious use of the brain metaphor. He says on page 217, the functions with which we are concerned are like those of the nervous system, including the brain, in relation to the rest of the body. So basically the executive is the brain of the organization. And indeed,
Thomas, yes? Sorry to interrupt you, Siddharthan. Could you try speaking loudly? Most people can hear you clearly, but if you can try.
Oh, yeah, still louder. Okay. So,
thank you.
Yeah. So the brain metaphors have been popular in business for a long time. And in fact, Gareth Morgan, in an influential book, Images of Organization, has a whole chapter, number 4, where more than 40 pages are dedicated to brain metaphors. He distinguishes between mechanistic models, which emphasize control and hierarchy, and biological models, which emphasize learning and self-organization. And he mentions following: consider how an understanding of the functioning of the brain challenges traditional assumptions about the importance of strong central leadership and control. Well, please remember it, because in a moment I will come with a very different view expressed by a neuroscientist. So by now we have two roots of, so to say, or two concepts of executive. That of implementation coming from law, politics, navy, artificial intelligence, and that of leadership coming from business and organizations. However, to understand how this came into the use in neuroscience, we need also to look at the frontal lobes. Now, the story of the exploration of frontal lobes is very long and complex. And what I want to do is to tell it to you, inspired by Akira Kurosawa's film, Rashomon. In this film, you have the same scene of a murder and rape told by four different people. First by the murderer, then by the woman, then by a monk who was observing it from bushes, and then by the ghost of the murdered man. So the first story is the one which I think most of you have heard, so I don't have to dwell long at it. That is the story of Phineas Gage, a famous case of an American railway worker who got a tremendous injury of his frontal lobes, but managed to recover, and in fact originally was believed to recover fully until people realized that he developed a very different personality. And after his death, it became famous as the American Kroger case from 1868. And later it was rediscovered in late 20th century by scientists like Damasio. The second story has a similar trajectory, but much more detail and color. So the first description of frontal importance of intellect is in 1261 in a poem Il Tesoretto by Brunetto Latini, who writes that in the brain we have like three celles, three rooms, and the anterior is the lodging of the intellect. Also, the Swedish mystic writer Emanuel Swedenborg described the frontal location of intellect in 1740s. The most important work probably of 19th century was that by Leonore Welt, one of the first women to study medicine in Zurich in Switzerland and write her PhD about the 11 cases of personality changes following frontal lesions. Then we have a series of descriptions by Arnold Pick of progressive frontal behavioral changes, and then a lot of studies based on the studies of brain injuries happening in the First and Second World War. However, this is still similar to the first story in that it is, so to say, the knowledge that got more and more elaborated. The story number 3 is the story of descent. So Hermann Munk, already in the 19th century, was saying that intellectual functions are everywhere and nowhere in the cortex. They cannot be localized. And Jacques Loeb in 1887 operated dogs and said removal of frontal lobes is completely harmless. There is no change in their behavior. He was immediately criticized by his colleague Eduard Hitzig as an apostle of lawlessness. However, similar observations in humans were done by Donald Hebb of the fame of what fires together wires together in Montreal in 1940s, where he was looking at patients who had big parts of their frontal lobes removed. And an interesting criticism came also from Paul Flechsig, very, very important in his studies on myelination, who found 2 types of association cortex in the brain, and he associated the frontal association cortex with emotion and consciousness, but he found that the posterior one, associated with language and abstract thinking, is the more important one. And now we are coming to story number 4, and as you know, now comes the ghost. The frontal lobes, since the beginning of 19th century, have been a battleground in the quest to find a biological proof of racial and gender superiority of white men. Baron Georges Cuvier in 1812 was claiming that the foreheads of Europeans are larger than of other races, which is a proof of larger frontal lobes and superior wide European intellect. Emil Huschke, around the middle of the century, distinguished the superior Caucasian frontal race from the Asian parietal and black occipital one, and of course believed that the male brain, being bigger than female, must also be superior. Paul Broca wanted to find out whether the Parisian skulls, Parisians being the intellectual leaders, must be bigger than those from the province, particularly from the Basque Country. He was very disappointed that in fact the Basque countries were, if anything, larger, and was reassured that at least the Basque skulls seemed to him more occipital, whereas the Parisians were more frontal. So the superiority of Paris was reinstated. And while most of the studies were on skulls, from beginning of 20th century, there are also studies of the real brain substance, also claiming that white and male brains have larger frontal lobes. Now, this will have been the landscape around 1950, 1960, where the term executive starts entering psychology and neuroscience. And the first notion that I could find is in the charming book by Ulrich Neisser, 1967, Cognitive Psychology, where there is a whole chapter, a small chapter, about the problem of the executive. And what Neisser does is an attempt to reconcile the conceptual world of Sigmund Freud with the emergent computer science. So his idea is that in fact we might have different unconscious thoughts running in parallel, and then the executive, so to say, selects the one which becomes conscious. And in this context, he also says that, of course, behaviorists must hate the idea of executive, because for them it would look like introducing the concept of the soul through the back door. Karl Pribram, in 1970s, in several papers, in his primate studies, uses also the term of prefrontal cortex being the executive of the brain. And the big move forward was in fact the model by Norman and Challis, 1980, who introduced the term supervisory attentional system to try to describe functionally the function of the frontal lobes. And the current term central executive was then introduced by Alan Baddeley in 1986. After description of the so-called slave systems of memory, he writes with a characteristic and charming modesty that central executive is basically the area of residual ignorance. Now, 2 years later, 88, Baddeley and Wilson introduced the idea of dysexecutive syndrome being, so to say, a clinical entity. The reason why it was important is because in neuropsychology we have a problem of confusing different levels of description. So we speak, for instance, about frontotemporal dementia, which is obviously an anatomical term, but then we divide it into semantic dementia and non-fluent progressive aphasia, which are, of course, functional terms. So from this point of view, to speak about dysexecutive syndrome meant that we are comparing functional with functional terms rather than having a mixture of anatomical and functional terms. Now, this was also the time where I started entering this field. Now, I have to say, I have never chosen executive functions as my topic of study. If anything, they have chosen me. I was always interested in language. I did my PhD on language disorders, on aphasia. But then around 1990, my supervisor, Klaus Wallesch, took me to a fantastic workshop in cognitive neuropsychology in South Tyrol in Bressanone, where at that time, executive functions were one of the big topics to be discussed. And although that name doesn't appear in different symposia of those years, they were discussed in connection with frontal lobes, of course, with movement disorder and with goal-directed action. And the question was always, is this just a group of unrelated functions, or is there something that can hold them together, the essence? Kurt Goldstein thought it might be lack of shifting and distractibility being two aspects of the same coin, and John Duncan later developing the idea of goal neglect. Jordan Grafman spoke of managerial knowledge unit, which of course will be a pleasure to my ear, as you can imagine, in the context of my comparison between business and neuroscience. It was clear that they depend on and work through other systems, and therefore it is very difficult to have pure tests of executive function because we are always testing something else with it as well, the issue which was addressed to as task impurity. And it was recognized, which already Ulrich Neisser recognized, that different processes can lead to the same result, a problem which only started being addressed with the advent of functional neuroimaging. Another issue was novelty. If executive tests are, or tasks are about dealing with novel situations, then a test can be novel only once. So by repeating the same test, we are making it into routine, and therefore it loses the position of an executive test. So let us attempt a definition of executive function. Part of it is awareness of the self as the agent, recognition of the implications of the action for oneself and others, theory of mind, ability to represent alternative acts and their outcomes, formulation of a plan of action, initiation and execution of appropriate actions, their monitoring and recognition of goal attainment. Now that would sound like a relatively good definition. However, what I just presented to you are the criteria for commission of a mortal sin put together by Roman Catholic theologians. So Pat Rabbit in 1997 commented very aptly, only the central executive can sin. Do we have functional models that improve on this already comprehensive theological description? Well, over the last 20 years, I would say two different ways have been followed. And one is that which was pioneered by a seminal paper by Miyake et al. Year 2000. Now, the reason why I have this slide together with this beautiful picture of Het Pand in Ghent was because I was in a conference there in 2016, conference on multilingualism, and I remember that listening to a series of talks, a whole symposium on cognition in bilingualism, I realized that every single talk started with the citation of Miyake and al. And their triple division of executive functions. So it became clear to me that what was probably a very good model in 2000 became canonized and fossilized. Miyake and al. Used a distinction between set shifting, updating and monitoring, and inhibition. Although in a later model, 2012, they reduced it basically to switching and monitoring. Now, one of the problems here is the absence of initiation and generation, which is one of the most important things in the clinical observation of patients with this executive syndrome. The other is that even the inhibition can be divided in different sub-functions which can dissociate, like response inhibition and interference suppression. And if you are interested in it, I will not have a time to explain it, but there is a very, very clear explanation in Ellen Białystok talk for Abralin. If you don't know, linguistically interested for you, you should the series of Associação Brasileira da Linguística, and here is the link. Now, the clinical studies went a different way, whereas in cognitive psychology, there was a tendency to try to reduce the components to less and less. In the clinical studies, we have usually between 5 or 10 components. In this model by Paul Burgess, I think 6. And what he very aptly observes is that we should get away from construct hegemony, rather than looking at an abstract concept and then looking how it shows itself in patients' behavior. We should be looking at ecologically valid function-led tests. Now, which of these two interpretations is the correct one? Well, I would say both are, it depends what we want to achieve. And at this place, please allow me to put one of my favorite metaphors, that of maps and mountains. Now, if I want to go from Edinburgh here to western coast of Scotland, where some of the most beautiful mountains are, I will not look for Ordnance survey maps, which are very, very detailed, but I would need 7 of them to get from this place to this place. I will take a Michelin map with 2-3 main roads. So that would be, so to say, the factor analysis that is popular in cognitive psychology. However, once I get to the mountain, I want to have a relatively clear picture. So for instance, here we can see exactly the ridge that we are ascending here. And as you can see, I don't make a step without a map, because the map can tell us where are the cliffs. And this is something that we definitely want to avoid. Now, I don't know any hill walker who has ever confused a map with the mountain he or she is climbing. So it is clear that a map is a construct, but an incredibly important one. We just need to have one which is appropriate for the goal. So in this case, not to fall off the cliffs. And that's why executive functions are so important in the fractionation in clinical neuropsychology. They are not only, I would say, one of the most fascinating topics of philosophical debates, they are also one of the most important aspects of clinical work. Frontotemporal dementia became more and more important issue of study, topic of study in late 20th and early 21st century. Cognitive deficits associated with motor disorders in Parkinson's disease and Parkinsonian syndromes like PSP, CBD, and multiple system atrophy, one of my main areas of research for many years, and in motor neuron disease. And indeed, even in the recovery of stroke, here we have a paper where we have shown that in fact, the executive symptoms are one of the best predictors of cognitive recovery after stroke. So their clinical importance is beyond doubt. And it's not just speaking about them generally, it's important to distinguish, to fractionate them in a way that can be done on the bedside. And here, I want to mention studies. I was really, really fortunate to work on Edinburgh's Cognitive Examination ACE with John Hodges and Maturanat, and now here in Edinburgh on Edinburgh Cognitive Assessment ECAS with Sharon and with Judy Newton. And this idea of looking at further and further fractionation has been taken further by Sharon and looking at different characterization of apathy versus depression, emotion and cognitive apathy in the scale that she developed with Radko Radakovic, and the empathy, again, Sharon and Sarah Macpherson looking at different aspects such as cognitive and affective theory of mind, inter and intrapersonal understanding. All these distinctions are important for diagnosis, for prognosis, and for management. And that, of course, brings me also to the fact that frontal lobes and therefore executive functions are important because they connect these areas of the brain with other parts of the brain and indeed beyond. So here I can only mention two important connections. One is to the motor system, and the reason I have a tree here is because my view of motor system is that the movement is a bit like a tree where we see the movement that we can observe is that like the tree we see under the ground. But we know that the movement is possible only because there are a lot of roots which make it possible, which we cannot see, but we know they exist. And in terms of cognition, this is the motor cognition as described by Marc Jeanneret in 2006. Before we execute any movement, we need an intention, which means initiative, generation. We need selection of the correct pattern, action semantics and switching. We need suppression of inappropriate actions, which includes, of course, social cognition. So disorders of motor cognition, and therefore of executive functions or aspects of it, are part of motor disorders, are an integral important part, because, as we formulated with Siddhartha many years ago, what wires together dies together. So basically, the neurodegeneration in motor disease, including motor neuron disease, is moving along functional lines. The second area I can only mention is emotion and decision making. So here we have the blossoming of affective neuroscience. I cannot really, in this short talk, speak too much about it, but this became one of the big areas of investigation of the last 20 years. And one thing I definitely want to mention is the work of Gerd Gigerenzer on heuristic decision making. The idea that heuristics is about our decisions that we do under time pressure with incomplete information in an uncertain environment. I don't think I have to convince anybody how important this is in the time of COVID. And here, just one of the books by, many books by Gigerenzer, Gut Feelings, which is interesting because I would have thought that about 20 years ago, would have perceived the idea of gut feeling as a pure metaphor, whereas now there is a blossoming field of studies about the connection between the gut, in fact, and the brain. So, yes, frontal lobes are important, yes, executive lobes functions are important, but they are connected to everything else in the brain and indeed in the organism. Now, I want to make a big jump to a very different view that started being proposed in early 21st century, where executive functions entered the public imagination. Now, if you just look at these two books by Elhonon Goldberg, published 2001 and 2009, I would say the iconography says it all. So here you have the kind of religious interpretation, almost the executive brain as the soul, and here you have very clear reference, again, not much space for gender equality, to the executives of businesses. And if those pictures don't convince you, then have a look what the author writes. They arrive at work in limousines with smoked glass windows. They ride to the top floors of the corporate headquarters in private elevators. Their salaries are beyond the average person's imagination, of course, the CEOs. And then he moves on, this book is about leadership. The frontal lobes are to the brain what the chief executive officer is to a corporation. You couldn't be more explicit, and in fact, to make it even clearer, he writes how important the leader is. Let the leader lapse, however briefly, disaster strikes, and then he attributes the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo to the fact that the emperor was not fully fit because of an exacerbation of a chronic illness. Now, there are two things which I find important but also scary about this. One is, I think this is probably the most dramatic example of bringing together metaphors of brain and business. But what happens here is the way, the authoritarian way in which the author interprets the business world and society is then projected on the brain. Then the way how the brain is described is then used as more or less the reinforcement of the authoritarian view of society. So we can see how those two things are deeply connected to each other. Basically, I would say this is the credo of new authoritarianism dressed in neuropsychological and neuroscientific clothes. Now, interestingly, if only Montesquieu or Voltaire would be alive nowadays, they were very clear in stressing that historical processes cannot be reduced to big individuals, to generals, to kings, and so on. So this would have been an idea which would have been quite controversial in the middle of 18th century. And of course, there's a lot of literature suggesting that this idea of strong leader might be problematic. But here, it is more or less rooted in neuroscience. And that leads me to a second problem, and that is the danger of neuroscience, which can become very, very good selling brand at the price of reducing it to a simplicity which is really far away from the sophistication that I was trying to show you in the previous decades in the description of executive functions. Now, we can then reduce everything to good and bad neurotransmitters, good and bad mindsets, and so on and so on. And here a nice proof how well it works. A beautiful study called The Seductive Allure of Neuroscience by Weisberg et al. In Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, 2008. They put together arguments, some of them being correct, a good explanation, and some of them being basically circular arguments. So without much knowledge, just with use of logic, it was possible to distinguish the correct from the incorrect. And indeed, both the beginners, the students, and the experts were good in their logical judgment, which I think is very reassuring. However, once you added to the explanation something like, this is because neuroimaging shows it, the novices, the students, abandoned their healthy judgment and believed every story as long as neuroscience was added to it. Interestingly, in neuroscientists, you have exactly the opposite. So not only don't they believe the stories with neuroscience added, even the correct stories lose credibility if the neuroscientific explanation is added inappropriately. And that's a little bit how I feel reading Goldberg and looking at the correct bits under the thick layer of hype. And that leads me to the last area that I want to discuss, in which there has been quite a lot of debate, particularly over the last 10 years, and that is executive function bilingualism. Again, I cannot give you a whole story or even 4 stories as I would like, but just to mention, by around 2000, bilingualism has been associated in many studies with effects on metalinguistic tasks, so the knowledge insight into language, social cognition, executive function, and over the last few years also decision making, the idea that we might make different decisions in our first, second, or third language. The important thing is they were always specific effects, for instance on switching, or explicitly on interference suppression. Here I have again the reference to the talk I mentioned already by Weisberg in a Bragin series. And they have also negative effects, the cost of bilingualism, for instance on lexical access, vocabulary, although this is controversial, and verbal recall. So from this point of view, I would say we have a relatively complex picture, exactly what I would have expected, and what hopefully you would have expected after what we heard about executive functions in previous slides. However, some of the arguments went that there must be a kind of simple one or yes or no answer, that either bilingualism is good and it must be good in all executive functions, or there is no effect whatsoever. So if a study showed effect on one but not the other test, then it was perceived as conflicting evidence. Now here we have really a definition of executive function as one rather than many, maybe even influenced through this idea of CEO. So in a way, you cannot be a CEO and not be a CEO. So either it's good and then it has to be good for everything, or everything is incorrect. Now, fortunately, bilingualism research moved away, and in fact, not only from executive function to functions, but also, as I would say here, from bilingualism to bilingualisms, to the insight that a lot of different aspects influence it. Age of acquisition, proficiency, with a recent study by Bice and Judy Kroll suggesting that even exposure to a language might have consequences for the way how brain processes languages. And then we recognize much more the importance of patterns of language use, which can change across the whole lifespan. And that makes also the social context and code switching into very, very important topics. So here's just a comparison of an early model of bilingual cognition by David Green from '98, where we still see SAS, by the way, the supervisory attentional system of Norman and Chalice that I told you about before. And here the move to the more recent models by the same author, by Green and Abu Talebi, the adaptive control hypothesis, where we see basically a much richer interaction with different elements, different practice. Now, the reason why bilingualism is so important is not only like executive functions because of intellectual speculation, but also of the clinical relevance. 2007, Weisberg observed that patients who speak more than one language develop dementia 4 years later than those who speak only one. And together with Suvarna Alladi, we did a whole series of studies in Hyderabad, in India. Why Hyderabad? Well, it's a place which has been multilingual for centuries, so bilingualism is not equal immigration there. We can distinguish these two things quite well. And there are excellent multilingual clinical services with multilingual team and tests available in different languages. We found the similar effect of 4 years in dementia patients, 6 years even in illiterates, because in India many people can be bilingual, trilingual, and illiterate. And interestingly, more effect in frontotemporal dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So again, we have the question of specificity. It's not completely yes or no. And even within frontotemporal dementia, in one of the biggest studies, or the biggest study in this patient group, we found 6-year delay, but only in the behavior variant. So they are effects, but they are very, very specific, exactly as you would expect. And you might remember in stroke that executive function was one of the best, or the best predictor of the outcome. Indeed, we found in a big stroke study that more than twice as many bilingual as monolingual patients showed full cognitive recovery after stroke. Now, one of the possible criticisms here would be that we are in the realm of so-called reverse causality. So is it learning language which has positive cognitive effects, or vice versa, better cognitive function makes you more likely to learn a language, which could be possible as well. And the best way of addressing this were the Lothian birth cohort studies, where we can look how people performed when they were 11 in 1947. They were all born in 1936. And then they are now in the 70s, and we can look how they perform now. And we found indeed, again, specific effects of bilingualism, some of them dependent, some of them independent on childhood IQ. So there is an interaction in both directions, exactly as we would expect. So the last empirical slide before conclusions is about language learning, because if there is this change in executive functions, we should be able to observe it when we follow people who learn a language. And the test we are using in a series of studies here is TEA, Test of Everyday Attention. But the question again here is not a simple one. Is language learning good for you or not? It depends what you are learning, how much, how often, how long. So here again we have a whole series, and we are still in the middle of this project, which started with a study in 2015 with Maria Mendoza, where we found that first-year students didn't show. First-year students of languages were more or less the same on this test of everyday attention, elevator task, so-called, with reversal and with distraction, as students of other faculties. But after 4 years of study, they were measurably, significantly better than the other students. Now, we found measurable effects even after 1 week intensive course in Salmor Ostak, the Gallic College on the Isle of Skye. And, by the way, in group from 18 to 85-year-old. And COVID caught us in the middle of a study which we are doing here, where we are looking at the learning of written and spoken Chinese completely separately. For reasons which are beyond this talk, Chinese is quite unique in that you can learn it quite separately, only written, only spoken version. And here we have basically this experiment, but as it happened, we had a wonderful crossover design. On the 12th of March, we finished our first block, and on 13th of March, the university is closed. So we had to continue the study in online format, and the next round for the next participants was only online. So here, it was the COVID which forced us to look what's going on. And we compared the perception. I mean, we didn't have enough data for a cognitive analysis, but we look how people perceive it in qualitative studies. And what we found is that people who started the test in face-to-face mode, when they switched online, they were grateful that we did an online test, but they felt that this is somehow an inferior way of doing it. It was an inferior substitute. Those who started online were incredibly happy and had a long list of things which they like about it. And I think, although, as I say, the online version was exactly the same, and I think this is something which maybe we can take with us, thinking about COVID. If we perceive all our activities, including, for instance, this talk that I'm giving here, as only inferior substitutes of the ideal face-to-face version which we did before, of course we will be unhappy. But if we try to recognize the new opportunities, maybe we find this period quite productive. And that leads me to my conclusions with Descartes through lockdown. What could be a benefit of this difficult year? One is maybe we can move from the cult of action at productivity at any price to a healthier balance in which action is more interspersed with reflection. For instance, thinking more about the concepts that we are using, because words not only reflect reality, they can create it. Maybe we could reflect a little bit more on metaphors, because we use them all the time, consciously or less consciously, but they influence the way we think. The way we think about society influences the way we think about the brain. And the way we think about the brain influences the way we think about society. The second thing is, maybe we could shift in our scientific disputes from I am right, you are wrong strategy to why do you see it this way strategy. I don't want to abolish scientific dispute. I think it is absolutely essential. But maybe we can move it to a more productive grounds rather than having both sides just repeating their arguments, trying to understand each other. I think this would be also a possible basis for what I would call intercontinental interdisciplinarity. Now, interdisciplinarity is something like altruism, very often professed, much less practiced. And I would say that most interdisciplinarity happens still at the regional level, at the borderlines of disciplines. What I am advocating with this talk is at intercontinental interdisciplinarity, really looking well beyond any disciplines that you think could be relevant to our work. And I think neuroscience is in a good position for that, because we are defined not by our origin, but by citizenship, not by where we come from, but what we do. Not that where we come from is unimportant, but exactly it is the different background of neuroscientists which makes this discipline so strong and so fascinating. And the last point is reappreciation of doubt. Now, this is an email I was just writing yesterday. And suddenly, this ultimately misleading was underlined. So I thought, oh, I did a grammatical error? And then Outlook corrected me. Words expressing uncertainty lessen your impact. Well, I don't think Descartes would agree. And whatever you might think about his philosophy, no one can deny that he had an immense impact on science and on philosophy with his, I would say, cultivation of doubt. And I think the problem that we have this year is not a problem of uncertainty. It is much more a problem of false confidence. And uncertainty can be, in fact, an antidote against a false confidence. And certainly not because we are stupid, we don't know anything, and so on, but because we are fortunate in that the subject of our studies is one of the most fascinating in the whole world, and that is the human brain. And that's why I would like to finish with a citation from Francisco Lopera, a Colombian neurologist who in fact has the biggest cohort of hereditary Alzheimer cases in the world. 2 years ago, when we were at a meeting in San Agustin in Colombia, he was asked by students to tell them one good advice for the end of the conference. And his advice was, be amazed. Be amazed by the work you are doing, but what you're discovering. Well, now I have good news for you. This is the end of the first half of my talk. The second half are the thanks. I have to thank, well, firstly to my karma for having such a wonderful place where I could study. To my PhD supervisor who took me to Bressanone, to all wonderful people I was working in Cambridge, in Edinburgh, in multidisciplinary collaborations and grants. I have to say that I have particularly to thank Alan, Barbara, Tim, and Paul, who were very patient answering all my long emails and questions, how they came to the notion of executive, but also to Catriona, Philip, and Katrin for helping me to understand the world of the history of ideas, particularly in 18th century political thinking, and also to people from business studies, like the two Chris's and Anne-Louise, and also to Karen Fleet, our librarian, who was incredibly patient with all my never-ending requirements. Then to prominent figures in linguistics, in neurology, in psychiatry. I have to say one of the greatest pleasures of preparing this talk were the conversations I could have through email with them. Then to my students, always a never-ending source of inspiration. And particularly I wanted to mention Mariana Vega Mendoza, who later became also my postdoc, and Brittany Blankenship, with whom I'm fortunate to work at the moment. And then, of course, to Edinburgh Neuroscience, to Siddhartha, and to Jane, who is the very heart of it, to Usher Institute, which has made this lecture possible. And always to my daughter Alba for being such a wonderful inspiration. Now, the reason why I finish with my Twitter handle is because over the next few days, if you are interested, I can send a lot of links to the papers, books, and so on that I was discussing via Twitter, so that get interested. So I want now to wish you all a very happy Immaculate Conception Day, happy Advent, Hanukkah, and Christmas, and a very happy New Year. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thomas, thank you very much indeed. That was a wonderful lecture, very wide-ranging, and you did well to cope with the couple of interruptions to raise your voice. We heard it all well. You held the audience. Time is tight, Thomas. There's quite a few questions, so we need very brief answers, please. Mm-hmm. So one common question is, do you think consciousness, as in having a subjective experience, is possible in the absence of executive functions like attention?
Oh God, to be honest, I would prefer to delegate the question or the topic of consciousness to people who are real experts on that.
Yeah, but give me your quick answer.
I think, to be honest, in question of consciousness, I am completely agnostic.
Okay. So then this question here is, are you aware of the latest findings of studies examining the decision-making process of judges?
Oh, I mean, I guess it is about the judges with before and after lunch, which has been a very, very interesting study. Well, that's a very good example how careful we should be with our judgments. So there was a study suggesting that judges make more, more harder decisions in the morning and then lighter ones after they had a lunch. However, if you really ask judges, and that's why I think it's so important that we speak with each other and not just look over each other's shoulders, some judges said, well, the problem is you put the more difficult cases in the beginning, the more severe cases, and then the lighter in the afternoon. So it could have been an effect of lunch, but it could have also been an effect of a planned distribution of cases. And that's why I think I'm very much in favor of interdisciplinarity, but we have to speak with each other. And I think without getting judges' views, we cannot really judge such a study.
Okay. Can you comment briefly, Thomas, on the relationship between executive function on the one hand and apathy or abulia?
Well, again, it's a very, very big topic because, I mean, the whole idea of motivation basically goes down to the old concept of will. So if you look at the previous studies, they would have, in, let's say, 19th century, look at the will. I think there is a connection that the same networks are involved in different aspects of apathy and anhedonia and so on, and in executive functions. But as I say, it is a association rather than a necessary connection. So I think there is a link, but it's not a mechanistic link from one to the other.
Okay, and because we're just coming to 7, thank you for that, Thomas. This will be the last question, and it's from Carolyn Patterson, your old friend from Cambridge. And the question is, do we have good norms for executive function? Is it appropriate to have those norms from healthy controls, or is there ones that you can control from patients with relation to their pre-morbid state?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I think the question of norms from patients is very, very important because, for instance, it could very well be that this discrepancy that I was referring to between the clinical and cognitive psychology is that, for instance, there might not be that much variation in initiation and generation in normal controls to produce a factor. But once this falls out in a patient, then it has dramatic effects. So from this point of view, I think if we want to really understand the processes, we need to combine patient studies with the studies in normal controls.
Okay, Thomas, thank you very much. You held your audience well. It was a great talk. There are quite a lot of questions, Thomas, so what we might do is collate them and share them with you. And then you've also generously offered your details to be contacted. And then finally, for everybody else, this talk is available on YouTube. So there are people asking whether slides and so on are available, so you can access it on YouTube. So Thomas, just on that note, then it's left to me to thank you again for a wonderful talk. It was brilliant to hear, and I'm delighted over 400 people between Zoom and YouTube managed to listen to this and can always go back to it. Thank you once again, and good night. Thank you, everybody.